Now, this is when the crisis spread from Wall Street to Main Street. After all, the ability to get a loan is how you finance the purchase of everything from a home to a car too. As you all know very well, a college education. It's how stores stock their shelves, and farms buy equipment, and businesses make payroll. So when banks stopped lending money, businesses started laying off workers. When laid-off workers had less money to spend, businesses were forced to lay off even more workers. When people couldn't get a car loan, a bad situation at the auto companies became even worse. When people couldn't get home loans, the crisis in the housing market only deepened. Because the infected securities were being traded worldwide and other nations also had weak regulations. This recession soon became global. And when other nations can't afford to buy our goods, it slows our economy even further. So this is the situation, the downward spiral that we confronted on the day that we took office. So our most urgent task has been to clear away the wreckage. Repair the immediate damage to the economy, and do everything we can to prevent a larger collapse. And since the problems we face are all working off each other to feed a vicious economic downturn, we've had no choice but to attack all fronts of our economic crisis simultaneously. The first step was to fight a severe shortage of demand in the economy. So the Federal Reserve did this by dramatically lowering interest rates last year in order to boost investment. My administration and Congress boosted demand by passing the largest recovery plan in our nation's history. It's a plan that's already in the process of saving or creating 3.5 million jobs over the next 2 years. It's putting money directly into people's pockets with a tax cut for 95% of working families. That's now showing up in paychecks across America. And to cushion the blow of this recession, we also provided extended unemployment benefits and continued health care coverage to Americans who've lost their jobs through no fault of their own. Now, you will recall that some argued this recovery plan is a case of irresponsible government spending. That it's somehow to blame for our long-term deficit projections. And that the federal government should be cutting instead of increasing spending right now. So I want to tackle this argument head on. To begin with, economists on both the left and the right agree that the last thing a government should do in the middle of a recession is to cut back on spending. You see, when this recession began, many families sat around the kitchen table. And tried to figure out where they could cut back. And so have many businesses. And this is a completely reasonable and understandable reaction. But if every family in America if every business in America cuts back all at once, then no one is spending any money, which means there are no customers. Which means there are more layoffs, which means the economy gets even worse. That's why the government has to step in and temporarily boost spending in order to stimulate demand. That's exactly what we're doing right now. Second, I absolutely agree that our long-term deficit is a major problem that we have to fix. But the fact is that this recovery plan represents only a tiny fraction of that long-term deficit. As I'll discuss in a moment, the key to dealing with our long-term deficit and our national debt is to get a handle on out-of-control healthcare costs, not to stand idly by as the economy goes into free fall. So the recovery plan has been the first step in confronting this economic crisis. The second step has been to heal our financial system so that credit is once again flowing to the businesses and families who rely on it. The heart of this financial crisis is that too many banks and other financial institutions simply stopped lending money. In a climate of fear, banks were unable to replace their losses from some of those bad mortgages by raising new capital on their own. And they were unwilling to lend the money they did have because they were afraid that no one would pay it back. It's for this reason that the last administration used what they called the Troubled Asset Relief Program. Or TARP, to provide these banks with temporary financial assistance in order to get them lending again. Now, I understand that TARP is not popular, and I have to say that I don't agree with some. Of the ways the TARP program was managed, but I do agree with the broader rationale that we must provide banks with the capital and the confidence necessary to start lending again. That's the purpose of the stress tests that will soon tell us how much. Additional capital will be needed to support lending at our largest banks. Ideally, these needs will be met by private investors who are willing to put in money to these banks. But where that's not possible, and banks require substantial additional resources from the government, then we will hold accountable those who are responsible, will force the necessary adjustments. We'll provide the support to clean up those bank balance sheets. And we will assure the continuity of a strong and viable institution that can serve our people and our economy. Of course, there are some who differ with our approach. On the one hand, there are some who argue that the government should stand back and simply let these banks fail. Especially since in many cases it was their bad decisions that helped create the crisis in the first place. But whether we like it or not, history has shown repeatedly that when nations do not take early and aggressive action to get credit flowing again, they have crises that last years and years instead of months and months, years of low growth, years of low job creation. Years of low investment, all of which cost these nations far more than a course of bold, upfront action. And although there are a lot of Americans who understandably think that government money would be better spent going directly to families and businesses instead of to banks, one of my most frequent questions in the letters that I get from constituents is, where's my bailout? And I understand the sentiment. It makes sense intuitively, and morally it makes sense. But the truth is that $1 of capital in a bank can actually result in $8 or $10 of loans to families and businesses. So that's a multiplier effect that can ultimately lead to a faster Pace of economic growth. That's why we have to fix the banks. Now, on the other hand, there have been some who don't dispute that we need to shore up the banking system. But they suggest that we've been too timid in how we go about it. This is essentially the nationalization argument that some of you may have heard. And the argument says that the federal government should have already preemptively stepped in and taken over major financial institutions. The way that the FDIC currently intervenes in smaller banks, and that are failure. My administration's failure to do so is yet another example of Washington coddling Wall Street. Why aren't you tougher on the banks? So let me be clear, the reason we have not taken this step has nothing to do with any ideological or political judgment we've made about government involvement in banks. It's certainly not because of any concern we have for the management and shareholders whose actions helped to cause this mess. Rather, it's because we believe that preemptive government takeovers are likely to end up costing taxpayers even more in the end. And because it's more likely to undermine than create confidence. Governments should practice the same principle as doctors: first, do no harm. So rest assured we will do whatever is necessary to get credit flowing again. But we will do so in ways that minimize risks to taxpayers and to the broader economy. To that end, in addition to the program to provide capital to the banks, we've launched a plan that will pair government resources with private investment in order to clear away the old loans and Securities, the so-called toxic assets that are also preventing our banks from lending money. Now, what we've also learned during this crisis is that our banks aren't the only institutions affected by these toxic assets that are clogging the financial system. AIG, for example, is not a bank, it's an insurance company, as I mentioned, and yet because it chose to insure billions of dollars worth of risky assets, essentially creating a hedge fund on top of an insurance company. Its failure could threaten the entire financial system and freeze lending even more. And that's why, as frustrating as it is, and I promise you, nobody is more frustrated than me with AIG. I promise we had to provide support for AIG, because the entire system as fragile as it is, could be profoundly endangered if AIG went into a liquidation bankruptcy. It's also why we need new legal authority so that we have the power to intervene in such financial institutions. The same way that bankruptcy courts currently do with businesses that hit hard times but don't. Pose systemic risks, and that way we can restructure these businesses in an orderly way that doesn't induce panic in the financial system and, by the way, will allow us to restructure inappropriate bonus contracts without creating a perception the government can just change compensation rules on a whim. This is also why we're moving aggressively to unfreeze markets and jumpstart lending outside the banking system. Where more than half of all lending in America actually takes place. To do this, we've started a program that will increase guarantees for small business loans and unlock the market for auto loans and student loans. And to stabilize the housing market, we've launched a plan that will save up to 4 million. Responsible homeowners from foreclosure and help many millions more to refinance their homes.